I have tutored conquerors, but my school was dismantled by a girl with a branch. My exoskeleton was polished to a mirror sheen, and my reputation as the chief of combat at Aegis Prime was flawless until the morning of the stick. High above the obsidian octagon, 14,000 digital eyes watched from the galleries as I lunged with a military-grade plasma cannon. The air screamed, ionizing into a violet haze that should have vaporized any organic matter in its path. But Gina Thorne did not vaporize. She vaulted through the superheated air, her body a blur of centered mass and controlled breath. I calculated a 99% victory. No. That was my ego calculating, not my HUD. As I prepared to cycle the secondary capacitor, I felt the unmistakable tap of dry wood against my lower carapace. The next lesson might hurt. Stay focused, because what she did to the master tactician is worse. 8 hours earlier, the morning light hit the obsidian octagon with a clinical, unforgiving glare. I stood at the center of the arena, my chitinous limbs clicking in a rhythmic display of readiness. This was the pinnacle of galactic military education. Here, we did not just teach soldiers. We forged the instruments of interstellar dominance. Every cadet in the stands was a scion of a warrior race, their bodies augmented by subdermal plating or neural link processors. Supply officer Fix, I projected, my voice echoing through the dampening fields. Status on the Terran candidate's equipment. Fix, a spindly Brintoke whose primary eyes were currently dilated in panic, scurried toward the weapon rack. He looked like a man who had accidentally deleted the archives of a dead civilization. He held nothing but a data pad that was blinking a frantic crimson. Sir, there has been a logistical misalignment at the Aegis Prime hub. Fex stammered. His breathing was shallow, a telltale sign of a species about to collapse under social pressure. The Terran shipment was intercepted by gravity well near the outer rim. The candidate's specialized kinetic rifles and pulse blades are elsewhere. In the silence that followed, I watched Gina Thorne. She stood at the edge of the octagon, appearing deceptively slight in her standard tissue grafe, fatigues. Humans were the new, primitive outliers of the Alliance, famous for having 206 fragile bones and a stubborn refusal to go extinct. She didn't look like a disruptor. She looked like a technician who had lost her way to the engine room. Then, I noticed the wrong detail. Amidst the hum of high-voltage shields and the restless shifting of armored students, Gina Thorne was perfectly still. Her breathing was rhythmic, almost melodic, unaffected by the adrenal-unheavy atmosphere of the arena. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the floor, measuring the friction of the obsidian tiles with the soles of her boots. So, I clicked, my mandibles sharpening in sarcasm. The human will fight the elite of Aegis Prime with her bare hands, or perhaps she intends to lecture us on the merits of diplomacy. The museum wing. Sir, Fex whispered. He reached into a secondary crate and pulled out a cylinder of dense, dark wood. It was a meter long, its surface wet-stained and unscarred by ancient impacts. It is a museum relic, sir. Literally a piece of a dead plant. A Lignin-Rod. The archives call it. Gina Thorne stepped forward. She didn't wait for permission. She reached out and took the stick. The way her fingers curled around the grips suggested an intimacy that made my primary height twitch. She didn't check the balance or test the weight. She simply closed her eyes for a microcycle, exhaled once, and nodded. This will do, she said. Her voice was minimalist, a quiet contrast to the grandiose acoustics of the hall. Sir, the laughter from the 14,000 witnesses began as a low rumble and peaked into a deafening roar. I'll let it continue. Arrogance is a structural weak point, but at that moment, I believed the weakness belonged to the human. I signaled for the first trial. Cadet V on entered the ring. He was a granite-skinned heavy from the volcanic moons of Krell, his body encased in power armor that could withstand a point-blank blast from a mining charge. He carried a heavy rotary pulse cannon. IV on didn't even aim. He simply began a suppression sweep, intending to pin the human against the far wall and end the farce. Gina didn't run. She moved in a series of jagged, fluid pivots that defied my predictive algorithms. Every time Viron's weapon hummed to life, she was already 3 centimeters outside the kill-down. The wooden stick wasn't being used as a shield. It was a sensory extension. She tapped the floor, then the air. Then, with a crack that sounded like a gunshot, she struck the cooling vent on the side of Viron's pulse cannon. The weapon didn't just stop. It detonated its internal magnetic containment. Viron was thrown back by the feedback, his armored hands smoking as the rifle turned into a useless hunk of slag. Gina stood over him, the wooden rod resting lightly on her shoulder. "Do you yield?" she asked. Viron looked at his shattered weapon, then at the smiling girl. He didn't speak. He simply crawled out of the ring. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with a new kind of tension. I felt the first ripple of cognitive dissonance. My HUD was recalculating Jin as threat level, but the data made no sense. A piece of wood had defeated a weapon worth more than a small colony. The precision wins, I commanded. My voice was tighter now. Tyrian moved like shadows. They were telepathic marksmen who shared a single consciousness. Their movements synchronized down to the millisecond. They drew twin lightsabers, the blades glowing with an intensity that distorted the air. They attacked from opposite flanks, a pincer movement designed to leave no room for evasion. What happened next was a masterclass in biological leverage. Gina didn't fight both of them. She stepped into Kira's space, using the stick as a pivot point. She jammed the end of the wood into the floor, vaulted 3 meters into the air, and used the momentum to kick Kara's helmet. As she landed, the wooden rod swept across Kira's shins. The twins fell in unison. Their telepathic bond, usually their greatest strength, became a liability as they both reeled from the same physical shock. Gina hadn't used a single energy cell. She had used gravity, friction, and the 40-centimeter reach advantage provided by a dead tree. I realized then that she wasn't fighting our weapons. She was fighting the pauses between our actions. She was reading the weapon's magnetic containment reset cycles, the tiny microseconds of vulnerability that every high-tech instrument possesses. "Enough," I said, descending into the octagon. The 14,000 witnesses grew so quiet I could hear the hum of the emergency lights. I reached for my own weapon, a military-grade plasma cannon, calibrated for vehicle operations. I took a moment to adjust the precious seal on my primary limb joint, a mundane habit I had performed for 17 cycles. It was the last moment of the old world. A weapon doesn't need a cooling vent if it doesn't rely on heat. Gina said, watching my preparations. "It also doesn't need a soul," I replied. "You have played your games, Cadet Thorn. But physics is not a game." I opened fire. The first 3 shots were ranging blasts, intended to force her into a corner. The sulfur tang of ozone filled my sensors. Gina moved, but she wasn't dodgy anymore. She was closing the distance. Each time I fired, she was half a step closer. The heat was enough to blister skin. Yet she didn't flinch. I saw her eyes. They weren't focused on the cannon's barrel. They were focused on my lower limbs, the heavy, sinew sagers that held my massive frame steady. She wasn't a primitive. She was a master of a 4,000-year-old iterative development cycle called Bojutsu. Humans hadn't abandoned the stick because they found the rifle. They had kept the stick because they understood that leverage is a universal constant. I fired the 4th shot. It was a direct hit, or it should have been. Gina slid under the superheated beam, the wooden rod planting firmly between my 3rd and 4th legs. She didn't push. She simply held the rod at a precise angle and shifted her weight. My own momentum became my executioner. I felt my center of gravity tip. The sickening sensation of weightlessness took hold as 1,400 kilograms of elite alien soldier was flipped over a piece of oak. I flailed, my forearms grasping it empty. Ionized air. The impact with the obsidian floor was a sound that broke the academy. It wasn't just my body hitting the ground. It was the sound of an era of technological arrogance shattering into dust. I stared up at the high ceiling, my primary eye twitching uncontrollably. A shadow fell over me. Gina Thorne stood there, the Lignin-Rod held vertically at her side. She wasn't breathing hard. She didn't look triumphant. She looked like she was waiting for me to acknowledge the data. Physics, she whispered, favors the simple. The silence of the 14,000 witnesses was absolute. In the VIP box, I heard a sound I hadn't heard. Barking laugh of Grand Commander Valen. He wasn't laughing at the defeat. He was laughing at the revelation. I lay there for a long time, watching the way the light reflected off the sweat-stained wood of the rod. My reputation was gone, and my school was in ruins. And yet, for the first time in 17 cycles, I felt a strange, terrifying sense of clarity. The Grand Commander was already leaning toward his communicator, likely requesting more primitive instructors for the elite corps. Tomorrow, I croaked, my voice rasping through my damaged vocoder. We learned to hit things with wood, because apparently, I'd been teaching war wrong for 17 years. The Lignin-Rod was moved 3 days later. It was no longer a museum relic or a piece of plant waste. It was placed behind 3 centimeters of reinforced, blast-proof glass in the center of the Hall of Valor. A small plaque was etched in the base, a warning to any cadet who walked past with a plasma rifle on their hip. I stood before the case, my lower limbs still aching from the leverage Gina had applied. The wood looked different now. It didn't look like a tool of the past. It looked like a silent, dark sentinel waiting for the next person to forget the basics. Somewhere in the distance, the first rhythmic cracks of wood hitting wood echoed through the training halls. A deep scratch remained on the surface of the rod where it had caught my carapace. The grain of the oak caught the artificial light, glowing like a polished bone.